He was just a quiet little boy sitting beside a powerful Japanese billionaire at a luxury dinner filled with businessmen and investors. Nobody paid attention to him, nobody knew what he was thinking, and nobody even tried to understand what he was going through, until one fluent maid, who was supposed to just be serving food and cleaning up, heard what he whispered in Japanese and decided to respond. What happened next left everyone completely speechless. Before we continue with this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video. Oh, and don't forget to comment below where you're watching us from. We love to know that. The Thompson family had spent weeks preparing for an important night. They were hosting a fancy dinner at their large mansion to welcome a group of Japanese investors. These investors were interested in the technology company owned by Richard Thompson, a very rich and successful American businessman. The entire mansion had been cleaned and decorated. Every room looked perfect, and the dining table was set with expensive plates, silverware, and crystal glasses. The guests started arriving around sunset. Among them was Kenji Watanabe, a well-known Japanese businessman, and his young son, Hiro. The boy was only 7 years old and didn't speak much English. Despite his young age, Hiro looked serious and a little nervous. Everyone at the dinner wore expensive clothes and acted very politely. Waiters served drinks and appetizers, while Richard walked around, greeting each guest with a smile. The evening had a formal atmosphere, and everything seemed to be going exactly as planned for this important business event. When all the guests were seated at the large dining table, Richard stood up to welcome everyone. He thanked them for coming and talked about how important the evening was for the future of his company. Then he began to introduce his latest project. It was a new artificial intelligence system that he claimed would change the way people use technology in their daily lives. Everyone at the table listened carefully. Some nodded with interest, others asked a few questions. Richard seemed confident and excited as he explained how the technology worked. He used simple words so everyone could understand, even though the topic was complex. While Richard spoke, the guests remained focused and no one interrupted. Kenji Watanabe also listened, but something about him was different. He didn't smile, and his body looked stiff, as if he was uncomfortable. He answered questions when needed, but his tone was serious. Richard continued his presentation, unaware of Kenji's strange mood. The atmosphere at the table was polite but quiet. Most of the conversation was between the businessmen. Their wives sat nearby, smiling politely but saying very little. They mostly watched and listened, careful not to interrupt. The children, including Hiro, stayed silent. Some looked bored, others just sat still. Hiro, however, was not bored. He seemed scared. He sat next to his father and looked at him the entire time. He didn't touch his food and didn't say a word. His big eyes followed Kenji's every move. It was clear that Hiro was not relaxed like the other kids. While the adults focused on business, Hiro seemed to be watching something else, something that worried him. He clutched the edge of his chair tightly and kept glancing at the door and at his father's hands. The boy looked like he wanted to say something but didn't know how. The language barrier made it even harder. He understood some of what was happening, but not everything. The dinner continued with more discussions about the project. Richard explained how the artificial intelligence could be used in schools, hospitals, and homes. He mentioned deals with other companies and how much money the investors could make. Everyone seemed impressed. Richard's tone was full of energy and pride. He believed strongly in his project and wanted everyone to see its value. The investors asked more questions, and Richard answered them easily. Meanwhile, Kenji gave short replies and didn't ask much. His eyes often moved around the room, and he seemed distracted. Every now and then, he would look at Hiro, who was still sitting quietly with the same worried look on his face. No one else noticed Hiro's fear. The adults were too busy talking about profits and future plans. Even the waiters moved quietly, avoiding eye contact. Everything on the surface looked perfect, but something was clearly not right between Kenji and his son. As the evening went on, Richard invited the guests to a small room next to the dining area, where a screen had been set up. There, he showed a short video about the new technology. The video had graphics, voice-over explanations, and real-life examples of how the AI system worked. The guests clapped politely at the end. Richard looked pleased with their reaction. Back at the table, dessert was served, and the conversation turned lighter. Some guests shared stories from their travels, others joked about business experiences. But Kenji didn't laugh. He stayed quiet and cold, only answering when spoken to. Hiro, still next to him, had tears starting to form in his eyes. He wiped them quickly, hoping no one would see. But his eyes never left his father's face. It was clear that something about Kenji's behavior was troubling the boy. Hiro sat frozen, his body tense, as if waiting for something bad to happen. By the end of the dinner, most of the guests were relaxed and satisfied. They had enjoyed the food, the presentation, and the company. Richard thanked everyone again and reminded them of the potential of the new project. The guests nodded, some shook hands with Richard, and others looked at brochures handed out at the end of the evening. Kenji stood up and said a polite goodbye, but his face stayed serious. Hiro followed closely behind, still looking scared and quiet. He didn't smile or wave at anyone. His eyes were red, and he held onto his father's sleeve. No one seemed to notice the boy's tears or the fear in his eyes. They were all focused on business deals and future meetings. As the guests left the mansion one by one, the night ended just like it started, elegant and well-organized. But Hiro's frightened face was the only sign that something much deeper was happening, something only he seemed to understand. Grace Miller had only been working for the Thompson family for 2 weeks, but she had already earned their trust. She was quiet, polite, and very efficient. Her job was to help organize the house, assist in the kitchen, and look after Hiro, the young Japanese boy who was visiting with his father. Since Hiro didn't speak much English, Grace often helped him communicate with the other staff and guests. That night, the mansion was busy again because of the fancy dinner with the investors. Grace moved around the dining room, keeping everything in order. She made sure the guests had what they needed, and that no glass or plate was out of place. Even though she tried to stay unnoticed, she paid close attention to everything happening around her. She saw the smiles, the polite conversations, and the way Mr. Thompson seemed proud as he spoke about his new technology project. To everyone else, it looked like a perfect evening. While she worked quietly, Grace noticed that something was not right with Hiro. He was sitting at the corner of the room, away from the main table, holding a small cleaning cloth in his hands. His head was lowered, and his shoulders shook slightly. Grace realized he was crying softly. The boy didn't look like he belonged at a business dinner. He looked lost and scared. She stopped for a moment, unsure whether to approach him, but her instinct told her to check on him. She walked slowly toward him, making sure not to draw attention. When she got closer, she saw the tears on his face. His small hands were gripping the cloth so tightly that his knuckles were white. She crouched down beside him and asked in a calm voice if he was all right. The boy didn't answer right away. He looked up at her with wide eyes, like he had just seen something terrible. Grace tried to comfort him, whispering gently, but Hiro suddenly spoke. His voice was trembling, and he said something in Japanese. At first, Grace didn't understand because she wasn't expecting it. Then, the words clicked in her mind. She had spent 3 years working in Japan before returning to the United States, so she knew the language well. When she realized what the boy had said, her body froze. For a second, it felt like the whole room disappeared. Hiro's exact words were clear. "My father is going to steal everything from him. Call the police now." Grace's heart started beating faster. She looked at Hiro, trying to make sure she had heard correctly. The boy stared back at her, his eyes wide open and full of fear. He wasn't lying. or confused. He looked desperate. Grace could tell that he believed every word he had just said. She felt a chill run down her back. Her first thought was to keep quiet and think about what to do. She didn't want to cause a scene during an important dinner, especially in front of the guests and Mr. Thompson. But the way Hero looked at her made it impossible to stay silent. His small voice, his tears, and the panic in his face told her that he was begging for help. Grace stood up slowly, her mind racing. She glanced at Kenji Watanabe, Hiro's father, who was sitting at the table talking to Richard Thompson. Kenji's expression was calm, but now Grace saw something else in it, something cold and unreadable. She took a deep breath and turned back toward the group. Everyone was still talking and eating, unaware of what was about to happen. Grace didn't plan her next move. She simply reacted to the fear she saw in the boy's eyes. Without another thought, she opened her mouth and spoke. Her voice was clear, louder than she expected. The room was filled with the sound of quiet conversation and the clinking of silverware, but her words cut through it instantly. She said, "The boy just said his father is going to steal everything from Mr. Thompson. He told me to call the police." The sentence hung in the air for a moment, and then everything stopped. The laughter, the eating, the movement of the waiters, all of it froze. Every head turned toward her. Richard Thompson's face went pale as he stared at Grace, unsure if he had heard her correctly. Kenji Watanabe stopped moving completely, his hands still on the table. Hiro sat motionless, looking down at the floor, afraid to look at anyone. Grace realized too late what she had done. The silence in the room grew heavier by the second. No one spoke, no one even breathed. The elegant dinner had turned into a scene of shock and confusion. Richard was the first to react. He stood up slowly, his chair scraping the floor. His eyes moved between Grace, Hiro, and Kenji. "What did you just say?" he asked, his voice calm but tense. Grace hesitated, her heart pounding. "He said his father plans to steal everything from you," she repeated, trying to sound firm, though her hands were shaking. Kenji didn't say a word. He looked at his son, then at Grace. The room seemed to shrink around them. One of the guests coughed nervously, and the waiters stood frozen near the wall. Hiro finally looked up, tears running down his cheeks, but he didn't speak again. Grace wished she could take back her words, but it was too late. The truth, or what seemed like the truth, was out, and everyone was waiting for someone to respond. Richard's expression changed from confusion to disbelief, and then to anger. Kenji finally broke the silence. His voice was low but steady. "There must be some misunderstanding," he said in English, forcing a small smile, but no one looked convinced. The tension in the room was thick. Grace stood still, not knowing what to do next. Hiro looked terrified, hiding his face in his hands. Richard crossed his arms and stared at Kenji, his mind racing to understand what was happening. The investors whispered among themselves, and the quiet elegance of the dinner was completely gone. What had started as a night meant to celebrate partnership and success had turned into a moment of suspicion and fear. Grace didn't know if she had done the right thing or made a huge mistake, but she couldn't ignore what the boy had said. The silence in the room stretched on, and for the first time that evening, everyone realized that something very serious was happening behind the polite smiles and business talk. After Grace shouted those words, the entire dining room fell into complete silence. Every person in the room turned to look at her and the small boy beside her. Hiro's quiet sobbing grew louder, his small shoulders shaking as he clutched the green cleaning cloth tightly in his hands. The guests stared in shock, not knowing what to say or do. The fancy dinner, filled with laughter and polite conversation just moments before, now felt heavy and strange. Richard Thompson stood frozen at the head of the table, his mind trying to process what had just happened. Kenji Watanabe's face turned red with anger. He pushed his chair back suddenly, the loud scraping sound echoing in the room. He pointed at Grace and spoke in a sharp voice, denying everything. "This is ridiculous," he said. "She doesn't know what she's talking about." His voice was filled with rage. Everyone around the table stayed quiet, afraid to interfere. Grace tried to stay calm, though her heart was racing. She looked from Kenji to Richard, then back at Hero, who was now crying harder, his eyes red and full of fear. "I only repeated what the boy said," she tried to explain, her voice trembling. "He told me..." But before she could finish her sentence, Kenji interrupted her loudly. "Lies!" he shouted. "This woman is trying to embarrass me in front of everyone. She wants attention." His words made several guests exchange uncertain looks. Some tried to smile awkwardly, pretending nothing serious was happening, while others whispered quietly to each other. Richard raised his hands, trying to control the situation. "Please, everyone, let's stay calm," he said, though his own voice was shaky. He didn't know whom to believe, Grace, the new employee, or Kenji, the important investor he wanted to impress. The whole evening was falling apart before his eyes. The atmosphere became thick with tension. The sound of Hero's crying filled the room, mixing with the nervous murmurs of the guests. One of the servers stood frozen near the wall, unsure whether to move or stay still. Grace's hands were shaking, but she refused to lower her eyes. "I swear, I'm not making this up," she said softly. "The boy said his father is going to steal everything from Mr. Thompson." Richard looked at her, then at Kenji, completely lost. Kenji's expression changed from anger to offense. "This is an insult," he said loudly. "You bring me here to do business, and now your staff accuses me of being a thief." He turned toward Richard with an angry glare. "Is this how you treat your guests?" His voice echoed through the room, and everyone felt the weight of his words. Richard looked pale, caught between his professional image and the growing chaos in front of him. Some guests tried to lighten the mood by laughing nervously, but their laughter only made things worse. It sounded forced, strange, and uncomfortable. Others leaned toward each other and whispered behind their hands, afraid to speak too loudly. Hero kept crying, unable to stop. The green cloth in his hands was wet with tears. Grace wanted to go to him, to calm him down, but she knew that any movement might make Kenji even angrier. Kenji glared at her with pure fury. "You should be fired for this nonsense," he said through clenched teeth. "You think you can speak Japanese and cause trouble? You have no idea what you're talking about." Grace felt her throat tighten, but didn't back down. "I know what I heard," she replied quietly. Richard rubbed his forehead, trying to think of a way to fix the situation, but nothing came to mind. The night had turned into a disaster. Richard finally spoke again, his voice tired and strained. "Please, let's just continue dinner," he said. "There must be a misunderstanding." He looked at Kenji apologetically, hoping to calm him down, but Kenji remained standing, breathing heavily. After a few seconds, he sat back down slowly, muttering something in Japanese under his breath. Grace stood frozen near the wall, feeling the eyes of every guest on her. Hero had stopped crying out loud, but was still sniffing quietly, his face hidden behind the cloth. The guests tried to return to eating, but the atmosphere was completely ruined. Every sound, the clinking of forks, the pouring of wine, felt unnatural. Grace looked at Richard, hoping he would believe her, but he avoided her gaze. She realized that speaking up might have cost her everything. Still, she couldn't stop thinking about the frightened boy sitting at the table. A woman in a black dress, one of the event coordinators, walked up to Grace and whispered something in her ear. Grace nodded slowly, her eyes still fixed on Hero. The woman took her gently by the arm and guided her out of the room. Grace didn't resist. She looked back one last time before leaving. Hero's eyes met hers for a brief moment, full of sadness and fear. Kenji noticed the look and pulled his son closer, placing a firm hand on his shoulder. The boy didn't move. Grace wanted to say something, to tell someone to protect the child, but the words never came. The door closed softly behind her, and the noise of the dining room faded away. Inside, Richard tried to regain control of the evening, forcing a weak smile as he asked the guests to enjoy their meal. But no one was comfortable anymore. What had started as a perfect dinner now felt broken beyond repair. The next morning, Grace was called into Richard Thompson's office. She walked through the quiet hallways of the mansion with a heavy heart. The house staff avoided looking at her, and the memory of the previous night played over and over in her head. When she entered the office, Richard was already sitting behind his large wooden desk, papers neatly stacked in front of him. His expression was cold and serious. "Grace," he said, without inviting her to sit, "your behavior last night was completely unacceptable." Grace's stomach dropped. She tried to explain that she only repeated what the boy said, but Richard raised his hand to stop her. "You caused unnecessary panic and embarrassed one of my most trusted business partners," he continued firmly. "I can't tolerate that kind of disruption." His voice was calm, but there was no kindness in it. Grace realized what was happening before he even said the words. She was being fired. Grace stood frozen for a few seconds. She tried to speak again, desperate to defend herself. "Mr. Thompson, I swear I didn't mean any harm," she said. "The boy was terrified. I just translated what he said." Richard looked away, clearly uninterested in her explanation. "Kenji Watanabe is a man I've worked with for years," he said sharply. "He's honorable and loyal. I will not allow anyone, especially an employee, to insult him or question his intentions." Grace's eyes began to fill with tears, but she stayed silent. "Your job ends today," Richard added. "You'll receive your payment for the month, and then I expect you to leave the property immediately." Grace nodded slowly, her throat tight. She wanted to scream, but she knew it wouldn't matter. Richard had already made up his mind. To him, she was just a servant who had ruined an important evening. There was no chance he would listen to her side of the story. When Grace left the office, the air in the mansion felt heavy and cold. She walked down the long hallway with her small bag in hand. None of the other workers said a word. Some looked at her with pity, others avoided her eyes completely. She felt like an outcast. The memory of Hiro crying, clutching that green cloth, haunted her. She could still hear his trembling voice speaking in Japanese, warning her about his father. It hadn't sounded like a lie. It sounded like a desperate cry for help. But now, everyone treated her like she had made it all up. Outside, the morning sun was bright, but Grace didn't feel its warmth. She stepped through the gates of the mansion for the last time, humiliated and heartbroken. She had lost her job, her reputation, and maybe even her chance to protect a scared little boy who seemed to know something no one else wanted to believe. At home, Grace sat on her small couch, still wearing the same uniform she had worn to work. She didn't move for a long time. Her thoughts were scattered, and she couldn't shake the image of Hiro's terrified face. Eventually she stood up, took out a notebook, and began to write. She wrote down everything that had happened, the exact words Hiro had said in Japanese, how he looked when he spoke them, how Kenji reacted, and how Richard ignored it all. She didn't want to forget any detail. Maybe someday, she thought, someone would need to know. She wrote slowly, her hand trembling slightly. Each word brought back the fear she had seen in the boy's eyes. When she finished, she closed the notebook and stared at it for a while. It felt like the only proof she had left that she wasn't crazy, that she had done the right thing, even if everyone else thought she was wrong. While Grace sat at home replaying every moment, life at the Thompson mansion continued as if nothing had happened. Richard and Kenji met again the next day to discuss their plans for the upcoming conference. They spoke about contracts, presentations, and future investments. The dinner incident was barely mentioned. Richard brushed it off as an unfortunate misunderstanding caused by a troubled employee. Kenji agreed with a polite smile, pretending to have moved past it. In truth, there was a strange tension in his expression, but Richard didn't notice. They made arrangements for their business trip scheduled for the end of the week. For Richard, it was just another opportunity to expand his company and impress the investors. For Kenji, it was something else entirely, something only he understood. The two men shook hands, sealing their plans, while the rest of the staff pretended that nothing unusual had ever happened. In the meantime, Hiro stayed behind under the care of a new nanny hired to replace Grace. The woman was kind but distant, and she didn't speak a word of Japanese. She tried to keep Hiro entertained with toys and books, but he barely responded. The boy, once quiet but polite, became even more withdrawn. He refused to eat with others and spent most of his time staring out the window or holding the same green cloth from the night of the dinner. He didn't talk to anyone, not even when spoken to directly. The staff assumed he was just shy or tired, but Grace's absence seemed to have changed him completely. When Kenji came home from meetings, Hiro avoided his gaze. The boy's silence grew heavier each day, and no one seemed to notice. Everyone in the house was too focused on business, money, and appearances to see that something was deeply wrong. No one cared to ask what Hiro was so afraid of. By the end of the week, Richard and Kenji packed their bags for the conference. The mansion was busy again, full of assistants and drivers preparing for their departure. Grace, far away from all of it, sat quietly in her small apartment holding her notebook. She thought about going to the police, but she had no evidence other than her memory and what Hiro had said. No one would believe her word over Kenji Watanabe's. She felt powerless, but deep down, she couldn't let it go. She knew something bad was coming, even if she didn't know what. At the mansion, Hiro stood by the stairs, watching his father leave. The boy didn't wave or say goodbye. His small hands tightened around the green cloth again. As the car drove away, the house fell silent. Everyone went back to work as if nothing had happened. But the silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was the kind that hides a secret no one dares to speak about. Convinced that something serious was about to happen, Grace couldn't sit still anymore. She kept remembering Hiro's terrified face and the exact words he whispered to her. Nothing about that moment felt like a mistake. She knew the boy was telling the truth. So even without a job and without support, she decided to start her own investigation. Grace didn't have special resources, but she had experience. Years ago, she worked as an assistant in a business office in Japan. During that time, she met people who understood corporate systems and how to access information. She reached out to a few old contacts by email, explaining briefly that she was looking into a businessman named Kenji Watanabe. At first, no one responded. Then after a few days, one person finally replied. It was a former co-worker who remembered Grace well and agreed to help her. With his assistance, she was able to start digging through public records and old company databases. What she found was strange. Through this contact, Grace gained access to several business documents connected to Kenji Watanabe. As she looked deeper, she started noticing patterns that didn't make sense. There were companies linked to Kenji's name that had no real addresses or employees listed. Some of them were located in different countries, but all had the same style of transactions, large sums of money moving in and out within short periods. Grace made a list and started printing every file she could find. She worked all night for days, cross-referencing company names, account numbers, and transaction dates. Slowly, she began building a dossier. Each page added more proof that Kenji was involved in something suspicious. One company would send money to another, and that second company would disappear months later. Grace didn't fully understand how it all worked, but she knew enough to see that this wasn't normal business. Still, she also knew it wouldn't be easy to make someone take her seriously. After gathering everything she could, Grace decided to go to the police. She believed they would at least investigate. She brought a folder filled with documents and showed it to an officer at the front desk. She explained everything clearly, step by step, but the officer didn't seem interested. He told her that unless she had direct evidence of a crime committed inside the country, there was nothing they could do. He also said that business fraud was complicated and usually handled by other agencies. Grace insisted, pointing to the papers, but the officer only glanced at them. "Without solid proof," he said, "we can't open a case." She left the station feeling frustrated and ignored. It seemed like no one wanted to get involved. As she walked home, she thought about giving up, but the fear in Hero's voice came back to her mind. She couldn't forget it. She knew she had to try another way. Later that week, Grace remembered someone who might help. Years ago, she worked with a man named Daisuke, a private security expert. He used to do background checks and had contacts in both Japan and the US. She reached out to him quietly and asked if they could meet in private. Daisuke agreed, and they met at a small cafe far from the city center. Grace showed him the papers and explained everything that had happened. Daisuke listened carefully and asked a few questions. Then he nodded slowly. "I've heard of Kenji," he said. "He's been investigated in Japan before." Grace leaned forward. Daisuke explained that years ago there had been a case against Kenji for fraud, but it was closed because of lack of international cooperation. The evidence existed, but nothing could be done without support from outside countries. Grace felt a mix of shock and relief. She was right all along. Kenji wasn't clean. Now she had to make this known somehow. Grace knew she couldn't trust business people or the police anymore. So she decided to take her story to the public. If someone in the media believed her, maybe pressure would grow and real action would follow. She searched for local journalists and small newspapers. Eventually, she found a small newsroom in a nearby town that published local stories and opinion pieces. It wasn't big, but it was her best chance. She printed out all her documents, made copies, and walked into the newspaper office. She asked to speak to a reporter and was told to wait. A young journalist came out and listened to her for a few minutes while flipping through her papers. At first, he seemed interested, but the more she explained, the more his face changed. He gave her an awkward smile and said it sounded like a theory. Grace insisted that the documents were real, but the man politely cut her off. "We can't run stories without confirmed sources," he said. Grace stood in the lobby of the newspaper, holding her folder, while the staff returned to their desks. The reporter had dismissed her story, calling it a conspiracy theory. He said they had no interest in publishing something based on guesses and unverified information. Grace felt her hands tighten around the folder. "But these documents show," she began, but the man interrupted. "Ma'am, if there's no formal investigation, we can't publish anything. That's the policy." She turned and walked out slowly, disappointed and angry. Outside, the day was quiet and the street was almost empty. She sat on a bench nearby and looked down at the papers in her lap. Everything she had found meant nothing to them. No one wanted to risk their reputation or time for something that wasn't already confirmed by authorities. Grace realized she was alone in this. No one believed her. But she also knew that the truth didn't disappear just because people ignored it. 2 days after Grace tried to expose everything she had discovered, she received an official document at her apartment. It was a legal summons. Confused and nervous, she opened the envelope and read the content carefully. The document stated that Kenji Watanabe had filed a formal complaint against her for defamation and for allegedly leaking confidential business information. Grace couldn't believe what she was reading. She felt her hands begin to shake. Kenji was now trying to turn everything against her. He was using the legal system to silence her. At first, she felt overwhelmed. She had no lawyer, no money for court, and no powerful connections. Later that day, when she checked the news online, things got even worse. A local news outlet had published a short article about her, calling her a former employee who had caused a scene and was now harassing a respected businessman and his associates. The article made her look like she was unstable and dangerous. Nothing about it was true. The story quickly spread through social media. Comments flooded in. Most people believed what the article said. Grace was labeled as crazy, obsessed, and jealous. Strangers posted insults. She received anonymous emails and messages threatening her if she didn't stop talking. Even people she used to work with began to distance themselves. One by one, she lost freelance cleaning jobs she had taken since being fired from the Thompson mansion. Clients cancelled appointments without explanation. Others said they didn't want trouble in their homes. Grace felt her life falling apart even more. But even with all that happening, she couldn't stop thinking about Hero. That boy had reached out to her when no one else had noticed. She kept remembering his words. They weren't just random comments. They were a warning. And now, everything she feared was becoming real. Despite the threats and the false accusations, Grace decided she would not give up. She still believed the truth mattered. One night, Grace sat at her kitchen table, reviewing her notes again, trying to find something she missed. She went through every detail from the night of the dinner. Then she remembered something odd. There had been a moment during the evening when one of the waiters had used a tablet near the back of the dining room. It had seemed out of place at the time. He had looked around cautiously, and the screen lit up briefly. She hadn't thought much of it then, but now it felt important. If that device was connected to the mansion's internal network, maybe it had recorded something. Maybe it captured conversations or even camera footage. Grace got up and searched her papers for the name of the company that had provided the equipment for the dinner. It took her an hour, but she finally found it listed on a printed invoice she had taken by accident when gathering materials weeks before. She wrote down the name and contact information immediately. The next morning, Grace called the equipment supplier. She introduced herself and tried to sound calm and professional. She said she was following up on a technical issue from the night of the dinner event. The person on the phone transferred her to someone from the tech team. Grace asked if the tablets used during the dinner were connected to any sort of storage or backup system. The technician confirmed that all the devices had been configured to sync with a cloud service used by the event staff. Grace's heart jumped. She asked if it was possible to access any of the data from that night, but the technician quickly added that, due to privacy policies, access to the backup could only be granted with a court order. Grace tried to push a little. She explained that something serious may have been recorded and that it could help expose wrongdoing. Still, the answer was clear: no access without legal approval. Grace hung up the phone and sat in silence. She now knew that a recording or file from that night might exist. If she could get access to it, she might finally have proof. But without a lawyer or legal support, getting a court order felt impossible. She had no one to represent her and no money to hire anyone. Still, this discovery gave her hope. She realized that she needed help, not just emotional support, but real legal and media support. She thought about going back to Daisuke, the security contact who had helped her earlier. Maybe he knew someone who worked with legal teams or investigative journalists. Someone who wouldn't be scared off by threats or big names. Grace took her notebook and wrote everything down again, organizing all her research in case someone did offer to help. She knew time was running out. Kenji had already tried to ruin her name. But maybe, just maybe, she still had one chance left. That evening, Grace took a walk around her neighborhood, trying to clear her mind. She couldn't stop thinking about the cloud storage. If that tablet captured anything, audio, video, even screenshots, it could change everything. But without access, it was just another dead end. She looked at the streets around her, so normal and quiet, and felt completely alone. No one knew what she was fighting for. To them, she was just a name in a strange news story. But deep inside, Grace still believed that truth had value. She didn't care about revenge. She didn't want money or attention. She only wanted someone to believe her and to protect Hero from whatever danger he had tried to reveal. As she walked home, she made a silent decision. She would find a way to get that back up, even if it took months. She would not disappear quietly. The truth was there, somewhere, and she wasn't going to stop until she found it. Determined to continue her investigation, Grace knew she had to take a risk. She didn't have the legal tools to get access to the cloud storage, but she remembered someone from her past who might help. Years ago, she had worked with a man named Leo, a computer technician who often helped companies recover lost files and fix systems. They hadn't spoken in a long time, but Grace contacted him anyway. She explained her situation briefly without giving too many names and asked if there was any way to access a private cloud without going through official channels. Leo hesitated, but agreed to meet in person. When they sat down together, she told him everything. She showed him the name of the equipment supplier and explained what kind of system had been used during the dinner. After listening carefully, Leo said it was possible, but risky. He warned her that accessing the cloud without permission was illegal, but Grace was firm. She told him it was the only way to protect an innocent child. The next day, they met again at Leo's small office, which was filled with old monitors, cables, and computer parts. He had already done some preparation and found a way into the server used during the event. It took several hours of work. Grace sat quietly as he typed quickly, bypassing passwords and security layers. She watched the screen closely, even though she didn't understand most of what he was doing. Finally, he accessed the backup folder from the night of the dinner. There were several files, mostly system logs and routine updates. But buried deep in one of the folders, Leo found a video file labeled with a random code. They opened it, and what they saw made Grace's heart race. The video was short and low quality, taken accidentally by a camera that had been connected to the sound system's control panel. The angle was off-center, but the voices were clear. It showed Kenji speaking with another Japanese businessman at the edge of the room. In the video, Kenji leaned in close to the man and spoke in Japanese. Grace asked Leo to rewind and play it again, just to make sure she had heard correctly. She translated as they watched. Kenji said the new artificial intelligence system was easy to copy. He explained that once the agreement with Richard Thompson was signed, they would move forward with their plan to take over the company. Kenji didn't use careful words. He spoke confidently, believing no one was listening. The other man nodded and smiled. Grace's hands began to shake. This was the proof she had been searching for. It wasn't just an opinion or a theory. It was a real conversation caught on video, showing clear intent to commit corporate fraud. She asked Leo to save the file and make several copies. He agreed and burned it onto a USB drive, then made backups on 2 separate devices. Grace left his office that day with hope for the first time in weeks. The next morning, Grace made an appointment with a lawyer she had found through one of her few remaining contacts. She met him at a small office in the city. She brought all her printed documents, the USB drive, and her notebook filled with notes. The lawyer, Mr. Dalton, was quiet and serious. He reviewed everything carefully. When he watched the video, he paused halfway through and rewound it. After watching it again, he looked at Grace. "This is evidence of a planned corporate conspiracy," he said. "If this can be authenticated, it proves that Kenji was planning to steal proprietary technology." Grace nodded, feeling a bit of relief. Finally, someone understood. "Mr. Dalton explained that normally this kind of video would be very strong in court, but there was a problem. Because the footage was obtained without legal permission, it couldn't be used officially unless a judge allowed it. He said the police might still refuse it. But he encouraged Grace to try anyway. "It's too important to ignore," he told her. Grace went straight to the police station after leaving the lawyer's office. She carried the video file on a USB drive. along with a printed summary and a letter from Mr. Dalton. She asked to speak to someone in charge of financial crimes. After a long wait, she was taken to a small office where a detective sat behind a desk. She explained everything calmly, step by step. She showed the documents, handed over the letter, and finally played the video. The detective watched the footage silently. When it ended, he asked how she had obtained it. Grace told the truth. She had used help from a technician to access the cloud storage. That's when the detective's tone changed. He told her that because the video was collected without proper legal authorization, it couldn't be accepted as formal evidence. Grace tried to explain again, but the answer didn't change. It might be useful later, the detective said, but for now we can't act on it. She walked out of the station with the USB drive still in her bag. She knew now that she was dealing with people who had power, influence, and resources. Kenji wasn't just a dishonest businessman. He was protected by connections and a system that ignored the truth when it was inconvenient. But Grace also knew that the truth was on her side. She had the video, she had documents, she had a lawyer who believed her. Even if the police weren't ready to act, she wouldn't stop. She would keep looking for ways to bring the truth forward. She thought about going back to the press. Maybe a journalist would be willing to listen now that she had real evidence, or maybe she could find someone inside the company who had doubts and was willing to help. Grace left the station that day, tired but more focused than ever. She wasn't done, not even close. In a moment of desperation, Grace made a decision she had avoided for weeks. She took everything she had, the video, the documents, and her handwritten notes, and published it all online. She created a public post on her social media page with a clear explanation, including the video of Kenji speaking about taking over Richard's company. Alongside the video, she uploaded the entire dossier she had built: company names, transaction records, and screenshots. She kept the language simple and direct. Grace explained how she got the evidence and why she believed the public needed to know the truth. At first, there was no reaction, but within an hour, the video started gaining attention. People began sharing it, commenting, and asking questions. Some were shocked, others angry. By the end of the day, the post had spread across different platforms. Hashtags began trending, and journalists started contacting her. Grace watched the numbers grow on her screen, knowing there was no turning back. She had finally made the truth visible to everyone. By the next morning, the video had gone completely viral. It had been shared by influencers, business analysts, and even public figures. News outlets picked up the story quickly, replaying the clip and translating the audio. A storm of media coverage followed. One of the most important developments happened when several shareholders from Richard Thompson's company saw the video. These were powerful people with real control over the business. Once they reviewed the footage, they reacted immediately. They called for an emergency meeting and froze all negotiations involving Kenji Watanabe. The partnership that had been so close to finalizing was suddenly on hold. Internally, the company began reviewing everything. Reporters dug deeper and uncovered information that had been hidden for years. In Japan, Kenji's past criminal investigations resurfaced. Old fraud cases previously ignored or dismissed were now being examined again. Grace had opened the door to everything. The media labeled it one of the biggest corporate scandals of the year. Back at his office, Richard Thompson sat stunned, watching the news unfold live on TV. He had trusted Kenji for years. They had built plans, shared ideas, and signed contracts. Now, everything was falling apart. The footage played over and over again across every news station. Reporters showed images of Grace, clips of Kenji, and screenshots of the documents she had released. Richard could no longer defend the partnership. The pressure from investors, clients, and the public was too strong. In response, he called a press conference. Cameras were set up, reporters filled the room, and microphones pointed at the podium. Richard stood in front of them, pale and tired. He announced the immediate cancellation of the business deal with Kenji Watanabe. He apologized to everyone involved, his employees, the shareholders, and the public. He said he had been misled and thanked the individuals who had brought the truth forward. For the first time, Richard said Grace's name out loud in front of the press. In a quiet apartment across town, Hero sat with the new babysitter, watching the news on television. His father's name was all over the screen. The reporters spoke about the video, the cancelled agreement, and Kenji's past fraud. Then they showed a clip of Grace walking into a government building to give her official statement. Hero's eyes lit up when he saw her. For the first time in days, maybe weeks, he smiled. It wasn't a big smile, but it was real. He recognized her face and remembered her kindness. He remembered that she had listened when no one else had. He held the green cloth in his hand and smiled again. The babysitter didn't notice the change in him, but something inside the boy had shifted. The fear he had been carrying was beginning to fade. For the first time since the dinner, Hero felt like someone was finally protecting him. That small moment meant more than words could say. Grace was contacted by the authorities shortly after the video went public. This time, it wasn't to threaten her or accuse her. Instead, they invited her to provide a formal statement. She went to the station, carrying her folder, and was treated with respect. Officers asked detailed questions, reviewed the evidence, and confirmed that her actions had helped prevent a serious corporate crime. She met with agents from different departments, including financial crimes and cyber investigation. They thanked her for her persistence and promised that her safety would be protected. In the following days, people from around the country began to show support. Messages of encouragement filled her inbox. Online, people defended her actions and praised her for exposing the truth. A few even started fundraising efforts to help cover her legal costs. For the first time since everything began, Grace didn't feel alone. Her name was no longer tied to false headlines. It was now linked to bravery and justice. While the truth continued to spread, Kenji made one last desperate move. Knowing the investigation was closing in, he tried to leave the country. He arrived at the airport with a small suitcase and a private flight booked under a different name, but someone had already alerted the authorities. An anonymous tip had been sent to the FBI earlier that morning. As Kenji approached the boarding gate, agents appeared and stopped him. He didn't resist. He was taken into custody and questioned immediately. Once confirmed, the arrest was made official. News of his capture spread quickly. Grace heard about it from a friend and then saw it on the news herself. She sat down, took a deep breath, and let the reality sink in. It was over. The man who had tried to destroy her had finally been stopped. She hadn't done it for revenge. She did it to protect someone who couldn't protect himself. And now, finally, the truth had come to light. With Kenji now in custody and the truth fully exposed, everything began to change for Grace. The story had reached a national and even international audience, and people who once doubted her were now thanking her. The same media outlets that had previously portrayed her as unstable began correcting their stories, highlighting her persistence and honesty. She was invited to speak on news programs and was interviewed by journalists who praised her for not giving up, even when she was threatened and ignored. One of the biggest moments came when Richard Thompson, the man who had fired her without listening, held a public press conference. Standing in front of reporters, he admitted he had made a mistake. He apologized directly to Grace, saying he should have listened and taken her seriously from the beginning. After the press event, he approached her privately and offered her a new position within the company, a role of trust and responsibility. Grace smiled politely, thanked him, but respectfully declined the offer. She explained that while she appreciated the gesture, she didn't want to return to the company where she had been silenced. Grace felt that her place was no longer there. She had moved on, and her mission had always been about protecting Hero and exposing the truth, not about getting a job. Richard understood and didn't insist. He told her he respected her decision and that the door would always be open if she changed her mind. Meanwhile, the investigation into Kenji's actions continued to uncover more details. Authorities revealed that his plan had been much larger than originally thought. He had intended to use Richard's artificial intelligence system to commit a widespread financial crime involving fake company shares, manipulated data, and stolen intellectual property. If the deal had gone through, it could have caused millions in losses and affected several companies across multiple countries. Thanks to Grace's actions, the plan was stopped just in time, and law enforcement agencies praised her cooperation. While the legal process moved forward, attention turned to Hero. After his father's arrest, the boy was placed under professional care and assigned a psychologist who specialized in child trauma. Hero had been quiet for a long time, but slowly he began to speak more openly. In one of his sessions, he told the therapist that his father had always warned him to stay silent, no matter what he saw or heard. Hero admitted that he was scared every day, but felt safe when Grace was around. He said he had trusted her from the first day she entered the house. His statement was included in the case file and helped build a clearer picture of the emotional abuse he had suffered. The public reacted strongly to Hero's words. Many people expressed concern and support for the boy, and some even sent letters and gifts. For Grace, knowing that Hero was finally receiving the help he needed was the most meaningful outcome of all. The impact of the case continued to grow beyond anything Grace had imagined. Once her story went public, more people came forward. Other individuals, including former business partners and employees from Japan and other countries, began to speak out against Kenji. They shared stories of shady deals, unpaid debts, and intimidation. It became clear that this was not the first time he had manipulated or threatened people, but it was the first time someone had fought back and succeeded. International authorities began reopening closed cases, and legal teams from multiple countries coordinated to investigate everything Kenji had done over the years. He now faced charges not just in the United States, but also abroad. The case became a powerful example of how corporate crime could be stopped when people were brave enough to speak out. Grace's name was now associated not with scandal, but with integrity and justice. Her actions had created a chain reaction that would protect others for years to come. Not long after the dust settled, Grace was invited to a civil rights event honoring individuals who had taken risks to protect others and stand up for justice. The event was held in a large auditorium, filled with people from all backgrounds, activists, lawyers, students, and everyday citizens who believed in doing the right thing. When Grace's name was called, the entire room stood and applauded. She walked to the stage, feeling nervous but proud. The host spoke about her strength, her persistence, and the impact her actions had made. Grace didn't give a long speech. She simply said that listening to a frightened child had changed everything, and she hoped others would do the same if they ever faced a similar situation. Her words were followed by another wave of applause. People stood clapping for several minutes. Grace looked out at the audience, realizing that what had started as a lonely fight had become something much bigger. She had found justice, and now she was being recognized for it. As the event ended, many people approached her to say thank you. Some shared their own stories of being ignored or silenced and told her that her actions gave them hope. Grace listened to each person with kindness and patience. She wasn't used to being in the spotlight, but she understood how important it was to show that standing up for what's right can truly make a difference. Later that night, She returned home and sat quietly with a cup of tea. Her apartment was still small and modest, but it felt peaceful. She looked at the notebook where she had written Hero's words so many weeks ago. She flipped through the pages slowly, remembering each step of the journey. From being fired and humiliated to being honored and applauded, everything had changed. But the most important thing was that the truth had finally come out. Justice had been served, not just for her, but for Hero, and for everyone else Kenji had tried to hurt. Months after the scandal, Grace's life was completely different. The woman who had once been fired and humiliated was now respected by thousands of people. She had used her experience to create something that could help others. With the support of volunteers, lawyers, and former colleagues, Grace founded an organization focused on protecting domestic workers and reporting corporate abuse. The goal was simple: give a voice to those who were often ignored and make sure what happened to her and to Hero never happened again. The organization offered legal guidance, emotional support, and public education. Grace didn't want people to feel alone the way she had felt. She gave talks at universities, attended conferences, and worked directly with victims of mistreatment. Every day, someone new reached out to her, and she listened to every story with care. She had become a symbol of justice, not because she was looking for fame, but because she refused to give up. What she built came from pain, but it turned into hope. At the same time, Hero's life was also changing. After the case was closed and Kenji was officially charged in multiple countries, Hero was placed in the custody of his mother. She lived in another state, far from the mansion and the business world that had once surrounded him. There, Hero began a new life. He started therapy regularly and enrolled in a small local school where he could be a normal child again. Grace stayed in touch with him. They wrote letters and had video calls, and when possible, she would visit. Their bond remained strong. Hero no longer cried during conversations. He laughed, told stories, and even showed her drawings he made in class. During one visit, he gave her a small picture of the green cloth he used to hold, the same one from that night. "I don't need it anymore," he told her. Grace kept it in a box at home as a reminder of why she fought so hard and what truly mattered. Meanwhile, Richard Thompson made big changes to his company. After the press conference and the end of his partnership with Kenji, he began a complete internal review of the business. He met with advisors, legal experts, and community leaders. They pointed out the weak points in the company's structure, the areas that allowed someone like Kenji to get so close. Richard felt ashamed, but committed to fixing it. He introduced new policies for transparency, accountability, and ethical practices. Then, after a few months of work, he contacted Grace again. This time, it wasn't a job offer in exchange for silence or comfort. He wanted her to help lead a new division in the company, one focused on community support, social responsibility, and employee protection. Grace didn't say yes right away. She thought about it carefully. She had already built something meaningful on her own. But after discussing it with her team and reflecting deeply, she accepted. If she could influence change from the inside, she would try. Her role at the company was very different from before. She was no longer serving food or cleaning rooms. Now, she sat in meetings with executives, drafted reports on worker treatment, and helped create partnerships with social projects. She kept her tone honest and her focus clear. People listened to her now, and she made sure to speak not just for herself, but for all the workers who never had the chance. Her background gave her a perspective that most corporate leaders didn't have. Grace also continued her work with her organization, balancing both roles with care. When media outlets wrote about her, they called her an example of strength and ethics. She was invited to events in other countries, gave speeches to students, and shared what she had learned. Her story wasn't about revenge or success. It was about doing what was right, Even when everyone said she was wrong, it was about holding on to the truth, no matter how loud the lies were. Journalists across the world started mentioning her name in articles about workplace justice and whistleblower rights. Magazines published her timeline from the night of the dinner all the way to Kenji's arrest. People called her the woman who didn't back down. In interviews, she always brought the focus back to Hiro. "It started with one sentence from a child," she said. "He trusted me, and I had to honor that trust." Her humility made the public admire her even more. She refused personal gain, avoided sponsorships, and donated most of the financial support she received to her foundation. She didn't want to become a celebrity. She just wanted people to feel safe. Slowly, her work began influencing not only corporate policies, but also political discussions. Lawmakers discussed ways to protect workers who report abuse. Grace was invited to speak at hearings and panels. What had started in silence had now become a global message. People deserved to be heard, believed, and protected. The impact of what happened didn't fade. It continued to spread through conversations, training programs, and legal reforms. Grace never forgot where it all began. Inside a dining room, during a formal dinner, with a scared little boy whispering something in her ear. That moment had changed her life. It changed the lives of many others too. The man who tried to silence the truth had lost his power. The people who stood by and did nothing had learned a lesson, and the woman who stood alone was now surrounded by voices, support, and respect. Grace didn't feel angry anymore. She felt calm. She had turned a painful experience into something real. She had proven that justice doesn't always come fast, but it can come when someone refuses to let go. The story was shared in classrooms, training centers, and even courtrooms. One small voice had set everything in motion. And Grace, the housemaid nobody believed, became a lasting symbol of truth and courage. Finally, we've reached the end of this story. I'm extremely happy that you've made it this far. Thank you very much for watching. Comment below what you thought and what was the best or worst part. Don't forget to subscribe until next time.